Noticing the time and the presence of a quorum, I call the January 28th, 2020 Acton Finance Committee to order. And I don't have a copy of the agenda.
Well, public participation is always.
So, public participation, Ms. Fredericks. And, we are also being recorded at Acton Public TV. If anybody's recording this, please make them known to the chair at this time.
Chair Fredericks, West Acton. I'm not recording. Well, I'm being recorded, but I'm not recording what.
You're being recorded, yes.
I'm not actively recording. I will say that I prefer the public participation to be at the end, and some committees have said that they like it before because it's just like the Board of Selectmen, but in the Board of Selectmen, we get to speak on separate issues. And if you're not going to let us speak on the separate issues where you're actually taking votes, I wish you'd have it, I wish you'd allow the public to speak when you're taking a vote. And if you aren't going to let us speak during that time, at least at the end after we've heard the discussion, it would be a great time to be able to talk. So I'm here to talk about housing and the Housing Production Plan Forum that's coming up. From what I understand, a lot of you guys will be there. And so some of the points I'd like to make really quickly is that I think that I hope that we focus on the what I consider public necessity housing, which is the folks that are extremely low income and disabled who never seem to get served by the plan. So if we're going to call a housing crisis a crisis because of these folks and then not serve them, we're effectively using them as pawns. And I feel like that's unfair, unjust, unkind. And I would like very much for us to be able to focus on them. And as we get to the 10%, as John's pointed out, we can be much more thoughtful in what we do. So I hope that we distinguish between public necessity housing and subsidizing a market want or the market demand. Just because the market demands it doesn't mean we would want to subsidize it with our water, road capacity, et cetera. So, and then I'll get to my last point is that the 32 unit project on Main Street, I believe it's 32, I believe that we could subsidize that further and get all very low, extremely low income housing for that and take care of the entire list of people that are the Acton housing list. If you take just the people who are in Acton, just the people who are very extremely low income and disabled, it gets very small very quickly. And we could take care of that entire list in that one foul swoop. And I've been sitting with groups talking about this, and people seem willing to subsidize that additionally. So I hope that you consider the possibility of doing that. And well,
I'm sorry,
yes.
Jared. Is this the one at the
Thursday
No,
night.
I know the forum is the property you're speaking about, the Main Street.
I hate to call it the daycare site, but that's how everybody knows it.
No, I think of it as the Walker property. I was trying to figure out what else to call it. So it's that
yes.
one. Okay, thank
yes. You. And also create a housing trust. There seems to be people willing to step forward, and I hope you support it when they do, to do more rehabs of existing buildings. Because again, as soon as we move to 10% and we get there, and we're still building, if we are, 50 houses a year, then creating 5 new units using existing housing stock is much more within reach. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to move on to our regular agenda items. And we're going to be talking about the municipal budget for the town, the Acton Boxborough Regional School District budget, and the Minuteman Regional Vocational Technical High School assessment. So I'm willing to let anybody speak on the committee, and who wants to start off? We talk about either one. Talk about the town, talk about the school, talk about Minuteman. But Mike's not here tonight, so we can't get it to take on Minuteman.
Well, I was going to ask, can somebody explain that increase to me?
John, would you be able to, John Mangiarotti, would you be able to tell us about the Minuteman increase, or speak to that?
Which particular increase are you referring to? Is there a document that you're referring to, or just generally what Minuteman's going to cost next year?
I believe you said you were going to, they had invited a number of town managers to come to a meeting there to hopefully talk some about the large assessment increase and what
Yes.
the basis was for that. If you
Yes,
could
that's
fill us in
coming
at all.
up Friday, yes.
Oh, that's this coming Friday.
Yes.
Okay.
So, but generally, the budget that was, the Minuteman's assessment that they put in, they gave to us early for the ALG process a month and a half ago, was based on the departmental requests, which a lot of times are different than the superintendent's ultimate request. And so what was discussed at the most recent regional school committee meeting was a slightly lower number than what we initially received from the district. So we're going to be collaborating with our school committee representative, Pam Norse, and I'll get some more information directly from the superintendent this week to be able to inform ALG and other folks with exactly what the status is of the Minuteman assessment for next year.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's some confusion over here. Could you explain how the member towns are involved in the budget approval process for Minuteman?
I can do my best. So each year, the district identifies the cost to run the school, and then they identify the cost of any capital that they're paying for, and then they apportion that to each member community based on what I believe to be a 3-year rolling average of enrollment, and then some other factors. So whatever we're paying this year is based on the enrollment calculation that they did leading up to their budget process, and that changes every year, both by the amount of money they need to spend and by the amount of students we have enrolled in the system. And in this case, there's actually a change in membership that happened with Belmont leaving the district within the last year or two. So that changed the numbers in a larger way and moved the allocations around. So that's my general understanding of it. But
I think, trying to ask a different question. I know I was trying to ask a different question. I don't think I succeeded. I'm wondering how, in the same way that our school committee approves the budget, they work with the district to get the budget approved. How is the Minuteman's budget approved? Do they have a school committee that our representative is a member of, or do they just?
yes, they have a regional school committee. Pam Norse is our representative, and she's actually the chair this year.
Okay, so, but she
And
was part
they
of the
bring a
approval.
budget to our town meeting. It's an article on our town meeting warrant, and that's if town meeting approves that budget, then that's us paying our assessment for the year.
Do you know, is the vote weighted? So in other words, if we have an overabundance of students there, do we have a larger say in how the budget?
I don't know. I don't have that answer, but I don't know. But I can certainly get back to you on that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
I'm going to guess no, because we're not the biggest, school. Arlington, I think, is the biggest by far. Arlington, I think.
Arlington and Lexington
Yeah.
have a lot of students there.
Yeah.
Put another way, if we had one student there, do we have a say in how the budget is handled?
I believe we do.
Okay.
Anybody else? Go. John?
It might make sense if you bring Pam Norse in. I had several of the same questions at our last ALG meeting. Also, Mike Majors, I believe, is a member of the finance committee there, so he would.
He is not. He said he's only on the building committee.
The building. Okay, but Pam Norse would be, I think, the person that we all need to hear from.
Okay, I'll have Mike reach out to her. Go ahead.
But it was an eye-popping increase. I think we all agreed on that.
In our regional.
Mr. Chair, in the past, in the run-up to town meeting, we have had presentations from Minuteman, the superintendent or deputy superintendent, in detail. So I think we should probably try and ask Pam to schedule the superintendent to come in and talk to us. We could even have a joint meeting with the Board of Selectmen since they seem interested as well.
Okay. Any other questions? could you give us the highlights of the differences between the budget that we saw originally on the budget meeting and the one that was voted in the other night?
Yes. The town manager's recommended budget that the Board of Selectmen voted to transmit last night?
Yes.
Yes. And before I do, I just want to mention that Pam Norse, the representative from the school committee, is going to be, I believe, scheduled to attend the next ALG meeting to give an update and presentation. So at least some of you will be there for that. And so with regard to the budget, so on December 3rd or 2nd, I mean, we presented a budget which represented a 2.5% increase in the operating budget and a 3% increase in overall spending. As part of that was a capital plan to spend just over $900,000 on various high priority capital needs. One of those needs was to overhaul the dispatch software systems and related equipment and alarm systems. That was a $185,000 request. And through the great work of our police department and through work in my office as well, we were successful in receiving a $150,000 grant, which allowed us to reduce the amount of funding requested for that project down to $40,000. An additional item that changed over the last month is that on January 6th, the Board of Selectmen took a vote and asked me to reduce or to change my recommendation for, as it relates to the River Street Dam. In the December 2nd budget recommendation, I had requested $135,000, or I believe $138,000 to address the several hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment we're going to have to make in that property over the next few years. But I was directed to instead seek funding through the CPC for that project and asked directly to reallocate that 138 to other priorities. So with those two changes, we were able to, I met with the team, the department heads, and we looked over a lot of the things that we weren't able to fit into the budget, because as I mentioned, actually in my correspondence to you, Mr. Chairman, that it was a great deal of effort that the town staff put forth to get this budget in at 3% and in the operating budget at 2.5%. And so there were several priorities that we weren't able to fund. A few of those were related to sustainability. The Acton Green Advisory Board met with me a few times this year and was very strongly recommending that we hire a sustainability coordinator. A part-time sustainability coordinator was one of the many positions that we weren't able to fund in the budget. However, with this freed up resource, we'll be able to hire a contractor to serve in that role on a sort of short-term basis, but meet that need. And as part of a $200,000 appropriation for sustainability policy implementation. Other items that would be covered in that project, program rather, would be the police cruiser fleet replacement schedule. I think you had a presentation to the Finance Committee on that over the summer. We weren't able to fund the full amount that the police chief requested in the budget, so this additional resource can be used to add 2 additional cruisers, EV or hybrid cruisers, to expedite that transition to a more efficient fleet. We'll also be able to install more charging stations throughout the community, which is a demand that is increasing rapidly. The ones out back are always used, and we're adding more, and we expect those to be used. So we'd like to add them in some other public facilities throughout the community. A third item, or an additional item that we're looking to fund in the sustainability program is the board set a goal to plant 30 trees per year, new street trees per year, and we added funding in the budget to address that. I don't know if it would hit the 30. We did request funding through CPC to do a historic streetscape project, which would add new street trees to historic districts. But there was kind of a gap in areas that aren't historic districts. So we would use additional funding as part of this $200,000 to supplement the tree planting program for street trees outside of historic districts. So that was one project. The second project that we added to the revised recommendation was a $60,000 study. And it's very responsive to concerns that I've heard regularly from the Finance Committee as it relates to long-term facility capital planning. So as you know, there was a study completed by town staff, I think in 2015, which was an assessment of all of our facilities. It created a piece of information, but it didn't create an implementation plan or an investment strategy for how to address all those concerns over the next 10 to 15 years. So the purpose for this $60,000 study would be to take the existing data from that, take information from the ADA transition plan, which we're going to be presenting to the Board of Selectmen in February, which has several recommendations for how to make our buildings and facilities more accessible. And a third item would be, as we're looking at how we're going to replace our infrastructure in all of our buildings, look very closely at the heating systems in all of our buildings and identify a roadmap or a strategy to transition all of our buildings away from using fossil fuels for heating sources. So, you know, if we're going to replace a boiler in 15 years, let's identify a way to change the way we heat the building and make it electric. And another part of the study, which I think will be useful, is it'll focus on aligning roof reconstruction projects with solar installations. So it's a big project, but it's very responsive to a lot of the concerns we have. There'll be a few buildings that wouldn't be part of that project. The DPW building, for example, we're already doing a study on that, so that would be excluded. So we believe the 60 is enough to handle the buildings that we have on the town side. And it would, so similar to what the schools presented last year with a 10-year plan to reinvest in facilities in a way that's responsible and helps keep the buildings operating effectively, we would hope to have a 10 to 15-year plan in the same fashion with some additional information for out years as well. And so with those two changes to the capital plan, the operating budget did not change at all. It's remaining at what we had proposed on December 2nd. The two changes to the capital plan result in a net reduction in the overall spending package of $23,000, which would bring the total spending package in at 2.94%, rather than 3%. So in a year that we worked very hard to fit within a number, it was also challenging to leave $23,000 on the table, so to speak, but we felt it was very important, given the feedback we've heard from the Finance Committee and from other folks about the major capital projects that we're working on this year and the strain it's having on taxpayers. So if we're able to find a reduction, we thought it was responsible to do so, and the Board of Selectmen supported that last night.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Any questions? Go ahead.
Ray Altieri stopped me at the end of the school budget meeting on Saturday, and I'm hoping I didn't misunderstand her. I thought she said that between the schools and you, there had been worked out so there was no longer the deficit that we're looking at and the how to pay for the budget next year, the current view of the budget. Did I misunderstand her, or if you?
No, that's, so I speak with the superintendent on a regular basis, almost every day. And following the last ALG meeting, we heard loud and clear, both from comments from the Finance Committee and comments from the Selectmen representatives, that you wanted us to try a little bit harder to figure this out and come back with a plan. And we're confident that we'll be able to come to the next ALG meeting with a plan.
Thank you.
Steve, Seegers.
So I just wanted to make a comment. I do see that in your budget presentation that you do have the capital scorecard that was missing last year and which is added this year, and I like it. Thank you for that. So my only comment is we have had, big, huge capital improvement projects passed this year. And along with that, the extra 3% is a little too much for the taxpayers. I do understand that, having gone, at least to my ability, that what I went through the budget, it seems fine, but it is a little too high. But I think it's okay, though. Thank you. Do we go on to the school thing,
We
too?
will in a moment.
Okay.
Steve?
Well, I can't complain too much. I am looking at my 26-liner, so. Do we know, and actually, I'll ask Brian, because it's kind of a ritual. I always ask him this time of year. So how's this year looking? Yeah, fiscal 20, we're going to come in $3 million under, or $1 million under, or?
It's very early, sir.
Well,
What I can tell you, and I haven't looked at the data yet, so we're in the middle of presenting or pulling together Q2 data for you, which we'll be presenting and working on the schedule coming up here in February. To be honest with you, I have not looked at those numbers, but I can tell you that nothing is jumping out at us right now where we think we're going to have any issues or problems. As you know, with a bottom line budget, John has all the flexibility to make sure that we bring that budget within the budget, and I expect that's what we're going to be doing. But right now, I think it's still too early for us to comment on where we are until we look at that Q2 data.
Well, that school budget presentation on Saturday, Dave Perlino was pretty clear that he was not guaranteeing anything that looked like a surplus on spending this year. So he seemed to say they'd come in pretty much as budgeted.
I think at this point in the game,
if I look at the last actuals we have, which were FY19, and look at your budget for 21, the salary lines look reasonable. The fringes are being driven by Middlesex more than anything. I do have a question on healthcare, because I know health insurance trust rates went up 4%, but you're not showing a 4% increase in the 21 budget. So is that because we underspent on healthcare last year?
I think part of that is when we formulate the budget for health insurance, the one thing that is trouble to get a handle on is we set the budget at this time of year, but open enrollment's not until April, until after town meeting. So that mitigates some of that cost as well. And we don't know going into that what that's going to look like. So that's always tough to gauge. So we can set a budget, and then people can choose HSAs or different programs which may help mitigate either some savings in there, but it's hard to know going into that where people are going to choose or what kind of health plan they're going to choose. So that's a lot of kind of guesswork, looking at kind of the driving a bus forward, looking out the back window.
I've heard that analogy before somewhere.
Yeah.
All right. So, but you're confident that you've cranked 4% rate increases into your healthcare budget? Okay.
We did.
All right. I'm good.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Appreciate it. All right, so let's talk about Mr. Martin.
Sorry, I just was looking up the answers to the Minuteman things. So the the assessment is done on a 4-year rolling average. And each town gets their assessment, can vote it up and down, and the resolution of that is provided under state law. The school committee has weighted voting. Both of these things that I'm saying about 4-year average and the weighted voting are in the most recent regional agreement, which was the very end of December 2015. So anyway, the school committee has weighted voting by the numbers of students in each town.
On this side? I did. go ahead.
I actually am very appreciative of the town budgets and the town manager's continued commitment to decreasing the reliance on reserves as part of the filling the operating budget. And I am especially grateful for coming in at just below 3%. I was a little frustrated with a fellow committee member, and I'm sorry if it's one of you here, because I honestly have no idea who said it. But there was a complaint that it was at 3%, not the 2.5 covered by Prop 2.5, to which I responded, well, that is what we put in our POV. So I think we should have a discussion next year when we're coming up with our point of view on whether we think that number should be 2.5% if that's really what we want, because you only get what you ask for. You're certainly not going to get that lower number if that's not what you're telling the people you want. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, John. And thanks for responding when I send you an email, too. I'm just relaying the committee's thoughts at that point. All right, so let's move on to the schools. Since I wasn't at Budget Saturday, considering I broke my leg, I would have better been at Budget Saturday than break my leg, if all being equal. So who wants to start off with that one?
Christy does.
All right.
I voiced it at the meeting, and I will continue to voice it. I'm frustrated with the decision to put money, to decrease the tuition for all-day K. I understand that there has been demand for it by the 250-odd families who put their kids into kindergarten every year. I really wish it had been done as an increase in financial aid to help kids afford it, rather than a straight decrease in tuition, because it's really a lot harder to raise tuition than it is to raise the bar on who gets financial aid. And I think it was disrespectful is a stronger word than I want to say, but I can't come up with a better one, of the large portion of the populace that does not directly benefit from the schools. And I know there's an argument that the schools support our property value, but they only support part of our property value. I appreciate the viewpoint of one of the school committee members that this was about providing equity of access to all-day kindergarten for the children. Having listened to the school committee debate on December 19th, there was not 100% support that there was, in fact, across the board value in having all children in all-day K, that there was philosophically experts out there saying there was some benefit to having an option of half-day K. So all in all, wasn't happy that it was thrown in there in terms of, I think it lacked an appreciation for what all taxpayers in Acton and Boxborough have done in this next year. And I was especially frustrated at the sense I got of the school committee's idea that their constituency is purely the parents putting kids into the school, and that they are working in the best interest of those people and their children. We want the school committee to work in the best interest of the children, but they are not only voted in by parents. They are voted in by the entire community and need to represent the taxpayers' best interests as well in this. And I'm sorry to be harping on the taxpayers, but I think that's part of our job up here. And while I appreciate for the all-day K that it is helpful to those parents, it is also detrimental to the seniors who are on fixed incomes and people who are on lower incomes in general, living off retirements that not necessarily even fixed income. So it was a small drop in the bucket, but in my mind it was indicative of a still lack of understanding in general.
So from my perspective, having sat through a couple of school budget presentations now, Christy and I have often sat there and thought, why are we adding this now? Why are we adding that now? And I felt much less of that this year. I didn't feel like there were an array of new things they brought to the table. In fact, this was kind of the one ask. And they tempered it. So from that perspective, I'm not convinced that they didn't look at the big picture and say, well, you know, we'd like to add these 10 things. Let's prioritize this thing and let's do it in steps and ease our way into it. So from that perspective, I'm not convinced they did it without an eye to the taxpaying population as a whole. That's my 2 cents.
Sahana or Steve, either one.
No. 2 things. Yes, there's done a lot of new programs, new anything in this budget, and it's probably the 3rd or 4th year in a row you can say that. The flip side of that is that, once again, we're assuming a 4.4% increase in teacher salaries, and there's increases in healthcare and Middlesex pension. And essentially, as we've said in our point of view for probably 10 consecutive years, the compensation growth cannot continue to grow at 4% a year when we have a 2.5% to 3% revenue model. It just doesn't work. So yeah, I'm disappointed that, you know, we're talking about, well, they're in negotiations now. It sounds like they were pretty close to being filled, that we'll be dealing with over 4% compensation growth at least for the next 3 or 4 years. The problem is it squeezes out new initiatives. Every cent we have of increased revenue growth goes to paying the existing people to do the existing jobs. You can reallocate people, and they're doing some of that, to, you know, take one out of here and put it over there because we think the need is greater, but you can't increase the total number of bodies available because all the money you have to pay for things is being given to the existing number of people you have. So that's disappointing. The other thing is that we need to get these ALG models fixed, because they're talking about 900 and something, you know, going to, from E&D into the operating, and not, we're showing like 585 or something. And that's all well and good if that's what it takes to close the gap for this year, but it wasn't so many years ago that Moody's gave a somewhat lukewarm endorsement of the school system based on their increasing use of reserve funds to balance their operating budget. So, you know, for a while we didn't have to worry about it because they didn't really have much in E&D. But now that they do, we're back to using more and more of our reserve funds to balance the operating budget, which certainly not a crisis, but when the bond rating agencies look at it, they're not happy to see that kind of a trend.
Real quick on that subject, will Moody's look at the entirety of the reserve, including the new stabilization fund and circuit breaker fund as well, or do they only look at the reserves?
I believe they'll look at the entirety, but if the stabilization fund was pretty much established to be part of a capital program, and so their point the last time was not capital, it was you're using your reserve, you're using your one-time money to balance your every year costs, and that's not sustainable. And, you know, to the other point I made about not necessarily having a turn back or a surplus this year, well, that was one of the funding mechanisms for that stabilization fund. We were going to put the $500,000 or $700,000 that we turn back every year into that. So we may not be able to do that this year.
So this is nothing about the budget, but one of the things that stood out to me was the student demographics. I'm hoping one of you guys can answer me this. There has been an increase in the economically disadvantaged students steadily. So are we missing something as a town here? Are we not looking at something? Why is it that we are seeing just on the school side, but have we even looked on the town side? Are we seeing something different? Why is the increase? Is my question.
So my understanding is that it's due to our town's commitment to reaching safe harbor and having more 40B housing, more low-income housing, that it's trend, if I understand correctly, it is trended with that situation. Does that make sense?
I think so, but you're sure that's the answer to that? Or do we have a different parameter from the state? Is that why we are seeing different, an increase in the curve in this particular thing? Is it something that we need to dwell deeper into?
I don't know who keeps that information. I can tell you that year over year, the median income in the town has been increasing. So if that's showing a different trend than the increase in the number of children who qualify for free and reduced lunch, then it's not an overall shift in the town.
I guess, Christine, I'd like to see some more analysis, because are getting into safe harbor, well, part of that is just stuff that's on the books to be built. There's not low-income kids living in those units.
But have we
yet.
made significant increases over the last 5-10 years?
That's what I'd like to see. It doesn't feel that way, but maybe there is. And the other thing is, a lot of affordable housing is seniors as well. So it would take some study to figure that out. I guess the question I have, has the definition of economically disadvantaged changed? Because you're right, the median income in town has not changed.
I just want to add to that there's a lot of information that we don't have about the demographics in Boxborough, which is included in those numbers. So I think it's tough for us to look at Acton in isolation and say this is what's causing this number to fluctuate without knowing what's happening in that town.
Good point, because they built that whole Paddock Estates a few years ago, which is pretty massive. Is that deemed affordable? I don't know.
I can tell you when I've gone by there in the morning going to work, going at 111 and get stuck behind the school bus. A bunch of kids get on at that stop. So I can tell you that. I agree with the teacher's salary's gone 4.4%. I wish mine did. I'd be really happy if it did. That's not reality, especially in the corporate world with the way the economy is and belt tightening right now. As far as the all-day kindergarten, I was in Roach Brothers and saw one of the school committee members, and the person asked me how I felt about that. And that person brought up that, they could do like financial aid, which I agreed with more than cutting and just giving it to everybody. Because I had ended up paying for it when my son went to all-day K. And I have coworkers who live in different towns, and if their kid goes all-day K, they got to pay for it too. And one of the coworkers had 2 kids, and he had to pay for 2 kids going through it. So I wish there was some more that it happened that way, more so than the way it did.
Do we want to ask them if they consider that? They did last one Saturday.
You can ask that.
If they consider scholarships. They didn't. They couldn't figure it out. That's what they said.
Sorry.
All right,
Apologies.
and then that's my 2 cents. But I wish I was there on Saturday, and unfortunately was unable to. Do we want to go over the, want to take a quick look at the 20, what is it called, the 26 liner or the 34 or the?
It originally had.
Brian, how many lines are there now?
Mr. Mangiarotti, is there a specific area that has caused for the increase in workers' comp? Is that a specific type of work we have happening?
No, it's not, no, it's just if we have more cases that are being, more claims. And so we have lost control. We have lots of training that we do. We're trying to find different ways to get people back to work sooner. We just happen to have a few unfortunate cases right now.
And is that in any way indicative of an aging workforce to a certain degree? My dad's a carpenter. I know he's had to do a lot more workers' comp claims as he has aged.
It could be. Not all the claims are related to physical labor type positions. Sometimes it's office staff that just happen to have an incident. So it's just an unfortunate situation that we hope was a trend that we can reverse going forward.
Thank you.
John, I have a couple of questions while we're looking over this quickly. And F19 budget versus actual, I'm noticing that purchase of supplies is, $134,000, $132,000 difference, that we were way higher than what the budget was. The gas and diesel, I understand, fluctuates with the price of gas and diesel fuel, but I would think that as our fleet becomes more efficient, that you'd see some sort of either leveling or dropping off in that case. But the one that really jumps out at me is purchase of supplies. It seems to be, a purchase, where is it? Sorry. Yeah, service and supplies are quite a bit different than what the budgeted was, so I'm wondering why the increase is there. And then this for 2020 budget, we have a drop from, we had 394 the year before, now we're down to 222. So they've shown quite a bit of a reduction.
Just given the fact that these are rolled up, it's difficult for me to identify specific purchases that were made. But in any given year, there is fluctuation with what's needed. And fortunately, in each of the last very many recent years, we've been able to complete the fiscal year without exceeding the budget available to us. And in the case of 19, I believe we returned back about 2% of what was available. So we do our best to control spending everywhere we can. If there were needs for additional supplies, I apologize that I can't identify exactly what those were, but I can assure you that they had to justify that need to me and to the department heads at the time.
Yeah. Any other questions from the committee? Steve?
Sure. What's the increase in the fringe category of educational incentive stipends, I guess?
That's a item that's very closely tied to the collective bargaining agreements that we reach with the public safety unions, one of which we are still working on.
So there's like the Quinn bill type stuff. And do we have that in the fire department now, or?
Yeah, so we're currently negotiating with the fire department, so it's really an unsettled contract that I'd rather not go into too much detail on. But yes, in public safety, we do provide incentives for education in both departments.
Would that, in the case of firefighters moving from, whatever they were, EMTs to paramedics, is that something that falls into this category, or is that?
No, this is, the other thing that created the increase is we've had people working on degrees, whether they had an associate's and they, over the last year, got enough credits to get to the next step for a bachelor's, or in some cases, I believe, we have some people that have attained their master's. So when that happens, the cost for that incentive goes up. But your question related to paramedics, that's training that is covered in other parts of the compensation.
Ambulance enterprise fund or something. Yeah, probably. Okay.
So just based off that question, I see something else different here. The employee development, that has increased to 3.8%. So does that come under the same thing, or that is something different than the training that you just talked about? It's under the total salaries and fringes, the first one.
So the FY '21 budget request is 120,000, which is 3,000 less than the FY '19 actual. It is an increase from the FY '20 budget, but employee development includes seminars, professional development opportunities, conferences, management training, several different things, and it's been something that's been a priority for me to, we have a workforce, some people are very experienced, but we also have a lot of people that are on the more junior side, and it's been a priority for me to make sure that we offer to them professional development opportunities so they can continue to grow and contribute in more ways to the organization. So professional development, we did decrease it in '20, but I propose to bring it back up in '21 because it's a priority for me.
No, not for John.
Anybody else? Thanks, John. What else we got, Mike? What else do we got? Uh-oh. We did those. So, do we have any minutes to approve, Brian?
We don't.
Minutes? No, we don't. Okay. Thank you. Committee liaison reports.
Mr. Chair, can we talk about this ALG plan for a second?
Sure. Let's go right into it.
So, I've heard from both the town manager and the superintendent that they're going to close the gap that is currently showing in FY '21. So it being the end of January, it's time to start worrying about what the other years say. So when's the next ALG meeting?
February 5th.
February 5th. And I just actually got the full model this afternoon, so I haven't really had a chance to go through the impact on reserves of how to balance the budget. But it is a discussion that needs to happen at ALG. If it doesn't happen on February 5th, it'll happen the next time you meet. If it doesn't happen then, it'll happen first meeting in March. And the longer you persist in having the discussion, the worse it gets. So I would encourage you to take a hard look, and I'll be happy to take a look at the numbers the next day or two and send you something. But, if we close a $443,000 gap, it sounds like some of that's coming out of E&D. But then the next year you got a 1.7 million gap. The next year, it's a typical pattern, but it's an unsustainable pattern, and part of the reason is what we were just talking about earlier in compensation growth. So whether we have enough reserves to get through these 2 years is what we have to go through the calculation and then decide, is that the way you want to balance the budget? Because the first question always comes to mind is, if we can do 3% this year, why can't we do 3% next year and the year after that? And so, but like I said, I encourage you to take that up at ALG. Because the sooner you can get agreement on that, the sooner we can all start worrying about what we're going to write in the warrant.
All right. Go ahead.
Your point earlier, Steve, about the lot of the problem that we see coming down the road from the 4+% salary increases. Especially strikes a chord with me, given the school committee's general desire to replace paraprofessionals with teachers, specifically, who I believe part of the definition is that the teachers are full-time. So not only do they have the teaching certification, which allows them to presumably have a higher salary, but also incur more of the benefit and other fringe expenses. While I agree with wanting to have a very highly qualified staff, I think strategic use of paraprofessionals, not just a blanket removal of them, and a potentially stronger reliance on them in some ways, could be a good way to look at not exacerbating this problem that we have coming down the line. Also, along with Steve's point of view, a recommendation that we look a few years out on this. Reminded me that I believe we're supposed to be looking at least 5 years out. It's part of our job compared to the town and the school looking 3 years out. So something for us to take a deeper dive into.
Diane?
There is no plan to do a blanket removal with paraprofessionals. It's going to be done in a very strategic way. For the average salary, I believe it's about like 2 for 1. So if we change out 2 paraprofessionals and hire 1 teacher at an M3 salary, master's level salary, the 2 paraprofessionals who left are full-time, so you're no longer paying their health care or their salary. So if you hire below an M3, there. In other words, there is some cost savings in there. So I just wanted to let you know that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Committee reports. Start down the end. Mr. Farley.
So I attended the Community Preservation Committee Commission meeting last Tuesday. There's really nothing of note and interest from that meeting for this committee. I did remind them that several weeks prior I had requested that a couple of them come to one of our meetings and present the list of projects for consideration in the upcoming fiscal year. Ray was not at this meeting last Tuesday. The chairman, so the acting chairman acknowledged and said they definitely want to come. They're interested, they want to do it. But they were still working on who would do what, and it was really up to Ray to do that. So I gave them the dates and the locations for our next 3 meetings, including tonight, and then the 2 meetings in February. And it turns out they're meeting on every one of those same Tuesdays as well. So I think it's going to be difficult for them to get here before March.
Yeah, they're going to have to get in as soon as they can, though, because if we give a recommendation, obviously, for the warrant.
Yeah.
So I'd implore that on them. It seems to be every year it's kind of slipping further and further back.
I've also got a couple of comments that I'd like to make on that, and I don't know if that you want to go through everything else first. I'd do it later, or do it now?
Do it now.
Okay. I actually put something together. I'll just hand it out to help guide the conversation. So my involvement this year as the liaison was really the first time I had any exposure to community preservation, so I want to do a little research on it.
Yep.
You may all know this, maybe I'm the only one who didn't, but just a bit of history. You know, the Act allows cities and towns to raise money through taxes up to 3% of the tax levy, and it provides for matches from the state as well. Voters here approved it back in 2002. And we approved it at a 1.5% surcharge rate. And for the next 3 or 4 years, we were getting actually 100% match from the state for those funds. However, as more and more towns adopted the Act, the resources from the state went down. And so I've laid out the actual impact from 2008 through 2018 here. And you can see that our surcharge keeps going up for our taxpayers. The state match keeps coming down. And it went from that 100% in the first several years to 19% last year, 17% the year before, and it's averaged 31% over these last 11 years. And so, what strikes me, it's not such a great deal for Acton taxpayers that it was 18 years ago when we all voted for it. And I almost wonder if this has almost become a solution in search of a problem. We're raising this money, but we're always looking for ways to spend it, and we have to spend what we raise. And just wondering if, the taxpayers should be given an opportunity to really revisit this. I don't know how it got on a warrant to be approved in the first place, and how or who would go about considering whether it comes up for debate again. But at a time when our tax assessment is going up $3 million a year, our deficit is running in the $2 million plus a year, and we're contributing $1 million to this. It's just, and maybe touching a third rail, I don't know, but I think it's worthy of conversation. But again, I'm very new to this, so I don't know, how you'd even begin to start that conversation.
I couldn't tell you that. Christy, you?
I have a question that I believe Brian can help with. My understanding is that the CPA surcharge is above our taxes. So this would not help us with our budget shortfall in any way. It would just cut the tax bills. I'm not saying I'm against that. I just want to clarify. Am I right?
That's correct.
So the CPA surcharge, the 1.5%, is calculated on the net bill. What I mean by that is the first $100,000 evaluation is exempt from the surcharge. So if you have a $10,000 bill, the first $100,000 of the evaluation, you would not pay that surcharge on. So that gets netted out of times the tax rate gets netted out of that $10,000, and the remaining balance is calculated at 1.5%. That's the surcharge that actually shows up on your tax bill, the town side. So for fiscal 2018, that's the $1,001,000, and then the state, obviously, as Tom had mentioned, the state match has been dropping, but that's.
But it doesn't go into town operating money in any way. It goes and sits off by itself. And
All this money sits in its own coffers and has its own set of rules. As Tom had mentioned, the CPA or the CPC kind of has control over this funding, this pocket of money. And there's certain rules that have to be followed, the 10% set-asides and so on and so forth. That's why you see that very long, detailed article on the warrant, and kind of that's pretty much following the rules of the CPC. And but that money is separated from general fund money. It's in its own pool, if you would.
Steve?
So, yeah, it's not like the good old days. 10% is required to be spent on historic preservation, affordable housing, and open space. Back when it started, there was a 100% match coming from the state. But more importantly, projects that came before the CPC, and not all of them, but a significant number of them had their own funding sources. And the evaluation that the committee used to do, and I was the liaison for a good number of years, and Roland was on the committee, John Benson was on the committee for years. Part of the evaluation was how much of their own money have they raised to go into this project. So that the classic example is, I think, Leary Field, where, the CPA put up a third of the money. I think the school district put up a third of the money, and the third of the money was raised from, Pop Warner football and Acton Boxborough youth soccer and a bunch of other people. Of late, we've seen money more, just straight, we don't have any of our own leverage to offer you. Just, we want some money to do this. And they all seem to be worthy causes, but at this point, we're not handing away the state's money like we used to. Now it's all our taxpayers' money, and it's a good question to raise. Not necessarily a third rail, but you're close. It's been a very popular program. But we don't get the same leverage as we did when this thing started, not from the state, not from the projects. So essentially, we're handing out taxpayers' money with a lot of restrictions.
So I could throw my 2 cents on having to chair that committee for 2 years and vice chair for 2 years before that. It's done a lot to preserve open space in this town. Wright Hill, Cowad, part of Great Hill, Simeone property, Simeone Cowad. It's another one I can't think of the top of my head. Also, some that just did off of Grassy Pond over here off of Newtown Road. All good causes. It's done a lot with recreation up in Nara and things like that within town. It also did a lot with the rail trails and get that moving forward and to do our design efforts on that, which if we were going to go through that with the town, it would have came out of the town budget to do that. But yeah, it is a tax on top of your tax bill. State money has been going down. No, you don't have 2019 on here. The state legislature, with its $1 billion in excess money that it happened to find, gave a bunch of money to CPC. I don't agree with that on the state level. You could use that for infrastructure, you could use that for substance abuse, you could use that for shoring up the T that's a disaster in a lot of areas. And there's a lot of other good causes I thought where that could have been better used. The city of Boston adopted CPA 2 years ago, and they're gonna get the lion's share. Any big city. So if you want to do something like that and see if it's still a good value for the taxpayers acting, you could sure do that. I don't know how you go about doing that. I don't know. I do know that looking on the Acton patch recently that I found the tax rate of every community in Massachusetts. So it's something that we're somewhere in the middle. We're not the highest, thank God. We're not the lowest. There's an island, there's a town in Martha's Vineyard that does it, but there's no services there, so.
Is that the Native American Day?
Yeah, Quina, or it's one of them out there. So I think you'd look at it as an entirety. I mean, I like CPC overall. I wish the law was a little different and how you could use it in some ways. I'd like to see more done with affordable housing with it. That is a 10% mandate, along with open space and historic preservation. And I figure if there's one other one, there's recreation is not a mandatory 10% funding.
It's affordable housing.
Affordable housing, yeah. So it's done a lot of benefit to the town for what, as you can see by the money that we have received from the state.
And I acknowledge all the good it's done. It's just the taxpayers aren't getting a chance to vote every year on whether we do this or this or this. This was decided 20 years ago, and now it's just happening. If this were not here, we could vote on it as part of a budget line item, whether...
You don't get to vote. You get to vote to how to appropriate the money that's already been taxed, as opposed to whether you... The one thing you should be aware of, Tom, is like many things, if you ended it tomorrow, it still wouldn't go away, because there's been a couple of things that have been handled on debt, and they are general obligations of the town. And if you did away with CPA, those would just revert to being regular town debt.
Yeah, that'd be Wright Hill, is the one.
Yeah.
It's bonded. That's, my question was, if you decided that, hey, we're not gonna have this anymore, what happens with the money that's in the set-aside funds within there? I mean, with the open space and the other ones that didn't meet their guidelines, and you still have open projects, and how does all that roll out?
Open space, I wouldn't see a problem. I think there's always open space we can buy.
Yeah.
The problem would be historic preservation. There always seems to be a dearth of projects that qualify. And, what would you do with any money you had left over? I believe it would still have to be spent for the purpose that it was set aside for.
I mean, I wish maybe there was a mechanism we could vote in every year. But I don't know if that's reality or not. Thanks, Tom. John?
Yes, Yeah, like Roland, I served 5 years on the Community Preservation Committee as vice chair and chair, and it's really was amazing with a modest amount of money that the fund has from year to year, the good projects that we were able to bring forward within restrictions. It's not any project that qualifies. It's got to be eligible for funding under the Act. Fund projects that we wouldn't otherwise have done because there wouldn't have been money in the operating budget to do that. We were one of the earlier towns to get into CPC in about, I think it was 2002, when you were getting about 100% match. And then other communities, smartened up. And I think where you get the greater match is if your town surcharge is as high as 3%. And I think if you get 3%, is it close to 100% match then, or 50%?
You go through 2 additional rounds.
Okay. Okay, so that's the way it's worked in the intervening years. But it would be very sad and disappointing if we decided to pull ourselves out of it, because it's really made a difference in projects, and particularly here around open space, where we acquired lots of good land. That was where Susan Mitchell Hart and her group had, worked with the owners and said, we're here, and followed them and was polite with them. And when the properties were available, they came to us first, and we moved aggressively on them. It really has made a difference. Otherwise, those properties would have gone to developers, and you would have had a lot more big houses in town. The differences you have in suburban communities is they go for open space. In urban areas, there's no open space, so a lot of their money goes to affordable housing. And just on the affordable housing point that you people were talking about regarding 40Bs, 40Bs go for what they call affordable housing, meaning the family income is $80,000. That's an area average to get in. Those are when you talk about, the 20, on a rental complexes, 20% of the units have to be, would go to afford people with $80,000 of family income, and the rents are set accordingly. That's very different than, I think some of you use the term low-income housing. That's essentially subsidized housing, where you get vouchers or Section 8 or the Acton Housing Authority. One good thing that CPC money went for was Whittlesey Village in North Acton. That was a really good project that cost, more money than was anticipated, and we supported that. So it's not something that I would really, walk away from. And one of the things that Tara and I have a lot of agreement on, when we talk about our affordable housing inventory, the way 40B works is you have to have a restriction in perpetuity that it's affordable. If you go up and down Route 2 and along Parker Street, you have plenty of properties that would qualify as affordable housing in terms of either rent or the price to acquire it as an owner, but they don't carry the restriction in perpetuity that they are affordable units. So, that's something you always have to keep in mind when you sort through this.
So I find this actually pretty interesting, especially since the match seems to be, this is back to the CPA, the match has been declining. There's a hiccup year of a good 52% in 2013, but other than that, it seems to have been declining. Obviously, the CPC is very important. It's very important to the town. But what if we were to create kind of a shadow CPC where we were able to dedicate a certain amount of monies on an annual basis without being able to accept this match, but what we gain in that is the ability to be flexible with what that percentage is, When times are really good, it might be higher. When times are bad, we have the ability to pull in the reins. But at the same time, I'm told we have to spend this money by the end of the year?
No, if you don't spend it in that year,
Yep.
it goes into a reserve
Okay. And for how long can you hold it in that reserve?
forever.
Okay, so it
Like,
can,
open space is a big reserve over, I think it was over 5 million. I don't know, Tom would have to find the number on that. I'm not- Or Brian, do you know that, I don't know if you know what CPC has, it's an open space, it's called a set-aside fund.
okay, but it has to remain in the CPC.
Right, so if any project, so any of the other ones that are mandated at the 10%, if you don't have 10%, say you have 8, the 2% has to go into the set-aside fund for that year.
Okay.
Then you use it in subsequent years. If at the end of the project, there is money that's turned back from a given year on a certain project that falls under one of the guidelines, other than recreation, it goes back into the set-aside, gets recaptured in the set-aside for that year.
Right.
Then you use it in subsequent years further out.
Right.
So where that becomes beneficial on open space is we know land's expensive.
Right.
And you have to be at the table to buy it. Under CPC, you can't go above assessed value. The town could then kick in extra money if they wanted to buy that property.
But if we had a shadow CPC, they wouldn't be constrained by any of these rules other than would be set by the town.
I don't know how you'd set that up legally within the entity of the town.
It's maybe
Yeah.
something to explore, but if we're being bound by what we spend it on, and there's other projects that we can't spend this money on, or, I mean, effectively what we're really doing is just appropriating to a group to spend this money, right, for select purposes, but we could create a broader ability to spend, maybe still with constraints, but a broader one nonetheless. Just a thought.
Christie?
I think you have to keep in mind that we're appropriating it outside of the tax bill. So this isn't within any of the discussion we're having about it, and it's outside Prop 2.5. So, and the debt overrides and all those other things. So trying to fit it within a budget that then goes through this whole process we're having right now of how many teachers do we have doing this and how many other things. I think it would be hard to actually appropriate money. I think it'd be great if we could, but I think actually getting money into the fund would be a challenge.
I also think we're getting a little bit off topic with.
No, sure, but
So-
if it's that important to the town, if it's not important to do that, then people should be voting to eliminate this altogether.
Any other reports? Go ahead, John. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a note that the governor just released yesterday, actually, January 27th, additional funding to the match. So the match for the current year is actually up to 23.9%, a total distribution of $247,192.
To Acton?
Yes,
23.9.
is the
And-
final percentage of reimbursement.
And what was the dollar figure on that? Sorry.
247,192. So that's breaking news of, I think we found out this morning. CPC knows about it. They're probably talking about it right now. I just wanted to make sure that, this is good data. I just want to make sure you had that data point to add to the
Great.
analysis. And additionally, the community adopted, Selectman Benson mentioned when, I don't know exactly what happened, but the community adopted the program and allowed for us as a town to assess additional
1.5.
fee on taxpayers. Without that authority, we wouldn't be able to assess any additional. We'd have to use the funding allocated within Prop 2.5 to set up such a fund that you're referring to, just so we're all on the same page.
Thanks, John. Any other committee reports there?
So I was at the select board meeting yesterday evening. Couple of points to make. There was a presentation on the train whistle ban for a quiet zone. We are currently exceeding the period of certification. An analysis has been done and we no longer meet the necessary conditions. There are a variety of solutions being that could be done at a variety of areas of cross streets, including areas of Central Street, Mass Ave, Parker Street, et cetera. It may affect some driveways. There are potential for 60-foot medians to be coming about. Is that right, John? Was that what it was? 60-foot medians. The good news is that we still have around $100,000 that was appropriated back in 2018 for the cost of this. So the town manager is going to be scheduling a forum to discuss the options going forward. There was the vote on the memorandum of agreement for the Powder Mill Affordable Housing Development. They're not currently connected to town sewer. In this construction, basically, they're going to be making connection, and please correct me or step in if I'm getting any of this wrong. I was taking as many notes as I could last night. Basically making a connection by creating a forced main on Powder Mill Road and part of High Street with a new pump station on High Street and an update to the Adams Street pump. Close? Good enough? There is a wastewater constraints issue. So as part of the agreement, there's going to be a development to pay the town just under $500,000 for a post-treatment holding tank. The value of the new sewer with all the construction is around $4.8 million. Add to that, this is what's being paid by the developer. In addition to that, the just under $500,000 for the holding tank, so a total of $5.3 million. The privilege fee for development is to be waived as part of the construction cost. For the new abutters, where all of this piping would be going, they would be required to pay a privilege fee, but there would be no betterment because that cost is being carried by the developer, not by the town.
Did they say how much for the privilege fee?
Well, that is up for a discussion at, I think, the next town select board meeting, because there's talk of the changes for what the privilege fees are going to be going forward.
But currently it would be $2.4 million instead of $8.5 million.
No.
It would be $2.4 million.
The privilege fee is to connect.
Right, $12,000 times each unit.
It'll be discussed at the next town select board meeting.
Just to, I feel like I need to clarify. So it's just about $2 million is what the calculation would be. If you multiply the 12,300 by the sewer betterment units that would be needed in that development. And the privilege fees aren't being waived. The privilege fees are being covered by an in-kind investment in the town's wastewater infrastructure. Not just, well, primarily it's pipes in the ground and a new pump station on Powder Mill Road, and it's upgrades to 2 existing pump stations, one on High Street and one on Adams Street right next to the plant. There's also some minor improvements to the interior of the existing plant that will all be paid for entirely by the developer. And the value of that work is estimated to be at $4.8 million. If it ends up costing the developer more, they'll pay whatever it costs. That investment is being made, which far exceeds what a privilege fee would be if it were to be paid instead of that investment.
So thank you. The memorandum of agreement was approved by the select board 4-1. Let's see, the sewer regulation bylaws and update to privilege fees. Privilege was another topic. Privilege fees are going to be discussed at the next select board meeting. But as far as the bylaws go, this was virtually the same discussion as the last select board meeting. There is still a debate over whether we should be going forward with changing the bylaws as they exist now, or maybe we're supposed to have a more holistic approach on what the town's needs are, what individuals' needs are, and have that discussion. That said, there's going to be a push for the sewer committee to do some data gathering on what other towns are doing in terms of charging their constituents for sewers. The last thing to note was an update on the proposal for the disposal of 3 School Street. Effectively, it's at the point where right now that there's an RFP out, and there have been a number of people pulling information for that, and there is a placeholder on the warrant for the next town meeting in the event that we need to vote for the town to sell. That's it.
The school committee hasn't met since Saturday. Most of us were there and we've discussed, so I think we're all set with the school committee. Thanks.
Christie?
Kelly's Corner Steering Committee met for the first time in a long time. The big news is that some number is coming out next week. The basic appraisals have been done. They're in the appraisal review process for the acquisitions that we would be making. Ideally, early February, we will hear back on that information from the appraisal reviewers. And then figure out where to go from there. But that'll give us a lot more of the numbers so we can decide our position as a committee on the overall cost of the project, what we'll know going into the spring town meeting, which this will appear in the warrant.
Steve? Our next 2 meetings for February are going to be at Acton Public TV, because this one's being used for pre-election things, so we can't be here, so just make a note of that. Mr. Benson?
Yeah, we could finish up on an upbeat note.
I like that.
The Mass Municipal Association had its, I think it was its 41st annual meeting this past weekend in Boston, and David and John and Joan Gardner and Peter Berry and I attended, along with several members of the professional staff in town. And it's a really spirited, and this was the second year I attended, and very committed group of municipal professionals and finance committee members and select board members. And you come away with, the goodness and the hard work that so many people throughout the Commonwealth, do day to day. The governor gave a very moving speech on Saturday morning. There was a former Air Force secretary who spoke to us on Friday. But, the big takeaway is we do an awfully good job here, both on the school side and the town side. I went to one Friday afternoon seminar where they were grappling with, how do school committees and the town side of government work things out. And they're sort of preaching this idea of, well, you've got to bring the leaders of the finance committee, the leaders of the select board, the leaders of the school committee, together into some form of a leadership group. And how do we do that? And I'm saying, well, God, we've been doing that since the late 1980s. And then they kill each other over formulas. How do you divide the pie? And, I, kind of walked out, we do 2/3, 1/3. There's no magic to it. It just works. And we just do it. So we're doing a really good job. And, thanks to all of you guys.
So I guess we're unique and other towns want to be like us. That's good to hear. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our meeting. So do I have a motion?
I move to adjourn the meeting.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. We're adjourned.